She handed over a security badge that looked like it had been through a washing machine twice. The security guard couldn't stop grinning as he held it up to the light like some kind of ancient artifact. "Ma'am, this thing looks older than my grandmother's driver's license," he chuckled to his partner. But when he swiped it through the scanner just to prove his point, the screen erupted with red text that read, "Classified Omega Clearance," and suddenly every alarm in the Meridian Research Facility started screaming. Nobody was laughing anymore, because that wasn't just some outdated employee badge. It was something that wasn't supposed to exist outside of the most secured vaults in the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist still clung to the glass towers of the Meridian Research Complex like fingers reluctant to let go of the night. Located in the heart of Ashford Valley, the facility stretched across 47 acres of what had once been farmland, now transformed into one of the most sophisticated technological research centers on the eastern seaboard. The main building rose 12 stories into the crisp October air, its reflective windows catching the early sunlight and throwing it back in brilliant sheets that made the surrounding parking lot shimmer like water. Most visitors to Meridian never made it past the public reception area on the ground floor. The real work happened in the secured levels above, behind reinforced walls and biometric scanners that could read everything from fingerprints to retinal patterns to the unique electrical signatures of human hearts. It was the kind of place where Nobel Prize winners worked alongside former intelligence operatives, where breakthrough discoveries were born in laboratories that officially didn't exist. The main security checkpoint sat like a modern fortress, just inside the soaring glass atrium. Polished marble floors reflected the overhead lighting, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere that was probably designed to inspire awe in visitors and remind them that they were entering somewhere important. Abstract art hung on the walls, the kind of expensive pieces that corporations commission to suggest innovation and forward thinking. A small cafe near the elevator banks served overpriced coffee to the handful of civilian contractors who were allowed this deep into the building, though most of the real employees used private entrances that bypassed this public space entirely. 2. Security officers had been manning the checkpoint since the 6 a.m. shift change. Officer Daniel Reeves was 26, fresh out of a private security training program, with the eager efficiency of someone who took his job seriously, but hadn't yet learned to read the subtle signs that experience teaches. His uniform was pressed, sharp enough to cut paper, his badge polished to a mirror shine, and his confidence in protocol was absolute. This was good work, steady pay, impressive location, and the kind of position that looked solid on a resume if he ever wanted to move up in the security field. His partner, Officer Janet Sinclair, had been at Meridian for 8 months longer, which in her mind made her the veteran of the team. She'd seen enough corporate executives and government liaisons pass through to think she could spot trouble, identify the important people, and handle whatever came through those doors. At 24, she carried herself with the slight swagger of someone who'd never encountered a situation she couldn't manage with the right combination of procedure and attitude. Neither of them had ever seen a security clearance above level 7. Neither had ever processed anyone with access to the classified floors above the 9th level. And neither had any idea that their morning routine was about to become the most significant few minutes of their careers. The woman who approached their checkpoint at exactly 7:43 a.m. didn't look like someone who would change anything. She moved with a quiet purpose that suggested she'd been in institutional buildings before, but nothing about her appearance screamed importance or demanded special attention. Her clothing was practical rather than fashionable dark slacks, a simple blouse, comfortable walking shoes that had seen some miles but weren't worn out. She carried a small leather handbag and a manila folder the kind of modest professional appearance that belonged to middle management or administrative staff. What would happen in the next 10 minutes would ripple through the Meridian facility, like an earthquake, reaching into boardrooms and secure conference calls, triggering protocols that hadn't been activated in over a decade. It would change how Reeves and Sinclair thought about their jobs, about respect, and about the dangerous assumption that you can judge someone's importance by their appearance. The badge she was about to hand them looked like something from another. Era-worn edges, faded colors, a magnetic strip that appeared to have survived years of use. To their eyes, it seemed like the kind of outdated credential that should have been replaced years ago. The kind of thing that probably belonged to some forgotten contractor who'd never bothered to update their paperwork. They had no way of knowing that the badge had been issued by a division that appeared on no organizational charts, for a position that existed in no public records, with an authorization level that most people in the building had never heard of and wouldn't believe if they had. But they were about to find out, and when they did, everything they thought they knew about their quiet Tuesday morning would change forever. The woman stepped up to their desk, reached into her handbag, and pulled out the badge that would turn their world upside down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Meridian Research Complex had been designed by architects who understood that impressive buildings projected power, and power attracted the kind of government contracts that kept facilities like this operational for decades. Every surface seemed to whisper of cutting-edge technology and unlimited budgets. The main atrium soared 40 feet overhead, supported by steel beams that had been polished to mirror brightness and arranged in geometric patterns that suggested both strength and sophistication. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher over the Virginia hills, burning off the last wisps of fog that had settled in the valleys during the night. The facility sat on what locals still called the Morrison Farm, though the Morrison family had sold their land to the government 15 years earlier for a sum that let them retire to Florida and never look back. Now, instead of corn and soybeans, the rolling fields hosted satellite dishes, emergency generators, and communication arrays that connected this isolated complex to networks spanning 3 continents. The public areas of Meridian had been carefully designed to impress without revealing. Visitors saw expensive art, gleaming floors, and reception desks staffed by professionals who spoke in measured tones about collaborative research initiatives and public-private partnerships. What they didn't see were the underground levels that extended 4 stories below ground, or the fact that the building's electrical consumption was roughly equivalent to a small city, or that certain elevators required biometric scans that checked for markers most people didn't know existed. Security checkpoints were positioned with mathematical precision throughout the complex. The main entrance checkpoint where Reeves and Sinclair worked was actually the least secure of 7 different access points, designed primarily to process contractors, delivery personnel, and the occasional government inspector who needed to verify that taxpayer dollars were being spent appropriately. The real security happened at levels most visitors never saw, operated by personnel who didn't wear uniforms and didn't appear on any public roster. The morning air carried the faint smell of fresh coffee from the cafe and the subtle ozone scent that always seemed to linger around high-end electronics. Somewhere in the distance, a maintenance crew was testing the emergency systems, their voices echoing faintly through the ventilation ducts as they called out equipment numbers and system statuses. It was the kind of routine background noise that marked another ordinary Tuesday in a place where ordinary was carefully maintained as a cover for extraordinary. The parking lot outside told its own story to anyone who knew how to read it. Most of the vehicles were standard government fleet sedans, dark colors, minimal features, the kind of transportation that blended into traffic and drew no attention. But scattered among them were other cars, a few luxury vehicles that suggested some employees earned significantly more than standard government pay scales, and several nondescript panel vans that looked like contractor vehicles but carried antenna. Arrays that belonged on military communications equipment. Employee badges at Meridian came in different colors, each indicating different levels of access and authorization. White badges were for contractors and temporary personnel. They could access the public areas, the cafe, and designated conference rooms on the lower floors. Yellow badges belonged to administrative staff and researchers working on unclassified projects. Blue badges indicated higher clearance levels, access to secured laboratories and restricted databases. Above blue, there were other colors that most employees had heard rumors about but never seen. The security desk itself was a marvel of modern technology disguised as standard corporate furniture. The scanner that looked like a simple card reader was actually connected to databases in 3 different federal agencies, cross-referencing not just the badge information but biometric data, current security statuses, and watch lists that were updated in real time. The screens that Reeves and Sinclair watched showed what appeared to be simple access logs, but buried in the software were algorithms that could detect forged credentials, analyze behavioral patterns, and trigger silent alarms based on dozens of variables that most security guards never knew they were monitoring. Behind the polished facade, Meridian hummed with the constant activity of a facility that never truly slept. Research labs operated around the clock, secured servers processed data streams from classified sources, and specialized teams worked on projects that would appear in tomorrow's headlines or never be acknowledged publicly at all. The building's architecture included features that weren't visible to casual observers: walls lined with copper mesh to prevent electronic surveillance, emergency lockdown systems that could seal entire floors within seconds, and communication arrays that could maintain contact with Washington even if conventional networks failed. The morning shift had settled into its familiar rhythm. Security guards checked IDs with practiced efficiency. Researchers moved between labs with the focused intensity of people working on problems that mattered, and administrative staff managed the endless paperwork that kept government research facilities operational. Coffee was consumed, emails were answered, and progress reports were filed. The ordinary business of an extraordinary place. In a few minutes, that routine would be shattered by a badge that looked like it belonged in a museum but carried authorization levels that existed in the most classified corners of the federal security apparatus. The morning would shift from routine to crisis in the space of a heartbeat, reminding everyone present that at Meridian, you never knew who might walk through the door or what secrets they might carry. But for now, it was just another Tuesday morning at a research facility where the most dangerous discoveries often came disguised as the most ordinary moments. Dr. Elena Vasquez moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago that true authority didn't need to announce itself. At 58, she carried herself with an understated elegance that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. Shoulders straight but not rigid, steps measured but not hurried, eyes that took in details without appearing to stare. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a simple knot that looked effortless but would hold its shape through a 12-hour day, and her clothing suggested someone who had made practical choices based on function rather than fashion. She wore a charcoal gray blazer over a cream-colored blouse, both well-made but not ostentatious, paired with dark slacks that had been tailored to fit properly without calling attention to the tailoring. Her shoes were black leather flats with rubber soles, the choice of someone who spent time on her feet and valued comfort over style. A simple silver watch adorned her left wrist, its face small and readable, the kind of timepiece that belonged to someone who needed to know the exact time rather than make a statement about their wealth. Her handbag was soft brown leather, worn smooth in places where her fingers naturally gripped it, with the kind of patina that spoke of years of use rather than deliberate distressing. Inside, her possessions were organized with military precision. A slim wallet containing exactly what she needed and nothing more. A phone in a protective case that had clearly seen some rough handling. Reading glasses in a hard case, and a small leather portfolio containing documents that most people would never be cleared to read. What struck observers about Elena Vasquez when they bothered to notice her at all was her stillness. In a world where everyone seemed to be in constant motion, checking phones, fidgeting with accessories, or radiating nervous energy, she possessed the rare quality of complete presence. When she stood, she stood. When she walked, she walked. When she listened, you could see that she was actually hearing every word, processing not just the content but the context, the subtext, and the implications that others might miss. Her face bore the subtle marks of someone who had spent time outdoors in challenging conditions. Fine lines around her eyes that suggested years of squinting into distant horizons. A slight weathering to her complexion that spoke of exposure to elements beyond office fluorescent lighting. Her hands were steady and capable, with short, practical nails and calluses that hinted at work that went beyond paperwork and meetings. These weren't the soft hands of someone who had spent their entire career behind a desk. When Elena spoke, her voice carried a slight accent that was difficult to place, something that suggested she had learned English as a second language but had spoken it fluently for so long that only the faintest traces of her origins remained. Her words were chosen carefully, not from uncertainty, but from the habit of precision that comes from working in environments where the wrong phrase could have consequences measured in lives rather than just careers. She had arrived at Meridian that morning in a rental car, a standard sedan with government plates that she had picked up at Reagan National Airport 3 hours earlier. Her flight had originated in Seattle, but before that, the trail became complicated. Elena Vasquez moved through the world using transportation networks that didn't always leave conventional records, staying in accommodations that existed in the gray areas between government facilities and private sector arrangements. The manila folder she carried appeared unremarkable from the outside, but its contents represented 15 months of investigation, analysis, and documentation that had brought her from research facilities in 3 different countries to this moment in the Meridian atrium. Inside were photographs that most intelligence agencies would pay handsomely to obtain, technical specifications for systems that officially didn't exist, and evidence of activities that connected seemingly unrelated events across multiple continents. Elena's background was the kind that created legends in certain circles while remaining completely unknown in others. She held advanced degrees in theoretical physics and applied mathematics from universities that most people had heard of, but her real education had come from institutions that appeared on no public records. Her work had taken her to places that didn't exist on standard maps, solving problems that governments preferred to handle quietly, away from public oversight and media attention. For the past 12 years, she had operated in the spaces between official agencies, the gaps in organizational charts where the most sensitive work got done. She answered to oversight committees that met in rooms without windows, reported to supervisors whose names appeared on no public rosters, and carried credentials that existed in databases maintained by people who had learned never to ask questions about the projects they were supporting. The badge in her handbag had been issued by a division that most federal employees didn't know existed, for work that spanned multiple agencies and crossed international boundaries in ways that made conventional jurisdiction meaningless. It represented authorization levels that existed above the normal classification system, access to information that was compartmentalized beyond anything that appeared in standard security manuals. Elena had hoped she would never need to use the badge again. When she had transitioned away from operational work 3 years earlier, she had assumed that part of her life was finished, that she could finally focus on the theoretical research that had originally drawn her into government service. But some problems don't respect retirement timelines, and some discoveries are too dangerous to leave unexamined. The investigation that had brought her to Meridian began 6 months earlier with an anomaly that most people would have dismissed as a data processing error. Elena had spent enough time working with classified systems to know that the most significant threats often announce themselves as minor inconsistencies, small deviations from expected patterns that suggested someone was trying very hard not to be noticed. As she approached the security checkpoint, Elena moved with the unhurried pace of someone who had been through similar procedures countless times before. She understood the psychology of institutional security the way guards were trained to look for nervous behavior, unusual patterns, or anything that deviated from normal procedures. Her appearance and demeanor were carefully calibrated to suggest exactly what she wanted them to see: a middle-aged professional woman conducting routine business at a government facility. She had no way of knowing that the two young security officers manning the checkpoint had never encountered anyone with her level of clearance, had never seen the kind of badge she was about to present, and had no training in how to handle the protocols that were about to be triggered. Their inexperience with classified operations would turn what should have been a routine credential verification into a moment that would redefine their understanding of the world they thought they were protecting. Elena reached into her handbag and withdrew the badge that would change everything. Officer Daniel Reeves looked up from his morning checklist as Elena approached the security desk, his practiced eye automatically cataloging her appearance with the efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of visitors over the past 8 months. Middle-aged woman, professional attire, no obvious security concerns, the kind of routine interaction that made up 90% of his daily responsibilities. He straightened slightly in his chair, putting on the polite but authoritative demeanor that the training manual recommended for civilian interactions. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with the crisp efficiency that he'd perfected since starting at Meridian. "I'll need to see your identification and any facility access credentials, please." His partner, Officer Janet Sinclair, glanced over from her computer terminal where she'd been reviewing the morning's visitor log. She had developed what she considered an expert eye for reading people during her time at the facility: who belonged, who was nervous, who might be trying to access areas beyond their authorization level. The woman approaching their desk triggered none of her usual warning signs, which in Sinclair's mind meant this would be another straightforward credential check that would be completed and forgotten within minutes. Reeves had been having a good morning so far. The overnight shift had passed incident-free. The coffee was stronger than usual, and he'd received confirmation that his request for additional security training had been approved. He took pride in his work at Meridian, viewing his position as an important step toward a career in federal law enforcement. Every procedure followed correctly, every credential properly verified, every interaction handled professionally. These were the building blocks of the reputation he was trying to establish. Sinclair, meanwhile, had been discussing weekend plans with the administrative assistant from the 3rd floor who had stopped by during her coffee break. The conversation had put her in a particularly good mood, and she was looking forward to the end of her shift, when she could meet friends for lunch at the new restaurant that had opened in downtown Ashford. Her attention was only partially focused on the woman at the security desk, her mind already drifting toward personal plans and social arrangements. Neither officer had any experience with classified operations, beyond the basic security awareness training that all Meridian personnel received during orientation. Their clearance levels allowed them to verify standard government credentials and grant access to public areas of the facility, but they had never encountered anyone requiring access to the classified floors above the 9th level. In their minds, security at Meridian was primarily about keeping unauthorized people out, not about processing individuals with extraordinary levels of authorization. The training they had received focused on recognizing forged documents, identifying suspicious behavior, and following protocols for denied access situations. They had practiced scenarios involving angry contractors, confused visitors, and the occasional individual who might attempt to gain entry through deception or intimidation. But their training had never covered what to do when someone presented credentials that existed outside the normal classification system. Elena reached into her handbag and withdrew the badge, placing it on the counter with the same casual confidence she might use when presenting a driver's license or credit card. To her, this was routine, another facility, another credential check, another moment in a career that had involved more security checkpoints than most people encountered in a lifetime. Reeves picked up the badge and immediately frowned. The first thing he noticed was its age. The plastic was slightly yellowed, the edges worn smooth, and the overall appearance suggested it had been issued years, possibly decades, earlier. The photograph showed a much younger Elena, but the image quality was different from current government IDs, with the slightly faded look of older printing technology. "Wow," he said, holding the badge up for Sinclair to see. "This is definitely vintage. Ma'am, when was this issued?" Sinclair leaned over to examine the badge, and her expression immediately shifted to amusement. "Oh my goodness, Daniel, look at this thing. It's like something from a museum exhibit about the 1990s. The badge bore none of the modern security features that both officers had been trained to recognize. No holographic elements, no embedded chips visible through the plastic, no QR codes or advanced printing techniques. The color scheme was different from current government IDs, with a blue and gray design that neither officer had seen before. Most importantly, there was no visible expiration date, which violated every protocol they understood about temporary and permanent credentials. "Ma'am," Reeves said, trying to maintain professional courtesy while barely suppressing a grin, "I'm not sure this credential is still valid. It looks like it might have expired sometime around the Clinton administration." Sinclair couldn't contain her amusement any longer. "Seriously, where did you find this? Did you get it from some kind of government surplus store?" She turned to Reeves with barely concealed laughter. "I bet if we scan this thing, it'll come back as format not recognized or maybe trigger some kind of historical archive warning." The exchange had attracted the attention of several other people in the atrium. A contractor waiting near the elevator banks glanced over with mild curiosity, and two administrative assistants who had been discussing lunch plans near the coffee shop paused their conversation to observe what appeared to be an amusing interaction. At the security desk, Reeves found himself caught up in his partner's amusement. The badge really did look absurdly outdated, and the situation struck him as the kind of minor comedy that would make a good story to share with friends later. "I have to admit, ma'am, this is definitely the oldest credential I've ever seen. Are you sure you don't have something more recent? Maybe something that was issued this century?" Elena remained perfectly calm throughout the exchange, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed. She had encountered skeptical security personnel before, had dealt with guards who questioned credentials they didn't recognize, and had learned long ago that patience was more effective than indignation in these situations. She understood that the officers were simply following their training and responding to something outside their experience. Sinclair was now fully engaged in what she perceived as harmless entertainment. "Daniel, we should definitely scan this just to see what happens. I bet the system won't even know what to do with it. Maybe it'll display some kind of error message like, 'Please upgrade to Windows 95 or something.'" The mockery was escalating beyond simple professional skepticism into genuine ridicule. Other facility personnel had begun to notice the commotion, and several were clearly enjoying the spectacle of two young security officers treating what appeared to be an obsolete government credential as a source of amusement. The situation was developing into exactly the kind of public embarrassment that institutional protocols were designed to prevent. Reeves picked up the badge again, this time examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "You know what, Janet? You're absolutely right. Let's scan this antique and see if we can crash the system. Maybe it'll trigger some kind of Y2K flashback. Neither officer had any idea that they were about to discover the difference between credentials. They understood an authorization levels that existed far beyond their comprehension. They were treating Elena's badge as a curiosity, a source of entertainment, an opportunity to demonstrate their superior knowledge of current security procedures. They were about to learn that some badges don't expire. Some clearances transcend normal administrative boundaries, and some people carry credentials that exist in the most classified corners of the federal security apparatus. But for now, they were just two young guards having fun with what they assumed was an outdated piece of government bureaucracy. Reeves held Elena's badge between his thumb and forefinger like it might contaminate his gloves, positioning it dramatically for his partner to see. "All right, Janet, let's give this relic the full treatment. I'm genuinely curious to see what kind of error message we get when the system tries to process something from the Stone Age." He moved toward the scanner with theatrical deliberation, clearly enjoying the moment. Several facility employees had now gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual commotion at what was typically a routine checkpoint. A maintenance supervisor paused near the coffee station, pretending to check his phone while obviously listening to the conversation. Two research assistants from the 4th floor had stopped their discussion about weekend plans to watch what appeared to be an entertaining demonstration of outdated government bureaucracy. Sinclair leaned back in her chair with an expression of anticipatory amusement. "I'm betting on a complete system rejection. You know how these scanners are with anything that doesn't match current specifications. Remember last month when Dr. Peterson's badge got demagnetized and the system practically had a nervous breakdown? The badge scanner at Meridian was a sophisticated piece of equipment that looked deceptively simple from the outside. What appeared to be a standard magnetic stripe reader was actually connected to a network that could verify credentials through multiple federal databases simultaneously, cross-reference security clearances with current status reports, and flag potential security concerns in real time. The system had been designed to err on the side of caution, rejecting anything that didn't conform to expected parameters rather than risk, allowing unauthorized access. Elena watched the proceedings with the same calm patience she had maintained throughout the interaction. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression neutral. She had been through variations of this scenario before: security personnel who didn't recognize her credentials, systems that took time to process unusual authorization levels, and the inevitable moment when people realized they had made assumptions about something they didn't understand. Reeves waved the badge in front of the scanner with exaggerated ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to witness the collision between 21st century security technology and what appears to be a credential from the previous millennium. Place your bets on whether the system will simply reject it or actually display some kind of historical artifact warning." The first scan produced exactly what both officers expected. The scanner's red light blinked once, followed by a soft electronic beep, and the screen displayed the familiar message: "Credential format not recognized. Please retry with valid identification." Sinclair clapped her hands together with obvious delight. "Called it. The system doesn't even know what to do with that thing. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're going to need to contact whoever issued that badge and get it updated to current standards. We can't process credentials that predate modern security protocols." The small audience of facility personnel seemed to share in the officer's amusement. A few exchanged knowing glances that suggested they were witnessing exactly the kind of bureaucratic comedy that made government work occasionally entertaining. Someone near the back of the group made a quietly sarcastic comment about keeping up with technology, which earned a few suppressed chuckles. Reeves held up the badge again, this time examining it with mock seriousness. "You know what? Let me try one more time, just to be absolutely thorough. Maybe if I scan it slower, the system will have time to consult its historical databases. He approached the scanner again, this time moving the badge across the reader with deliberate slowness, as if the machine needed extra time to process something so ancient. The red light blinked again, the same error message appeared, and Sinclair let out a small laugh that she tried unsuccessfully to suppress. "Daniel, I think you're going to break the scanner if you keep trying to feed it artifacts from the Clinton administration. That poor machine probably thinks you're trying to scan a museum exhibit." The repeated failure seemed to vindicate everything both officers had assumed about Elena's credentials. In their minds, the situation had progressed exactly as expected. An outdated badge had been presented. The modern security system had appropriately rejected it, and they had professionally, if somewhat playfully, explained the problem to someone who clearly needed to update her paperwork. Elena continued to stand quietly through the entire demonstration, showing no signs of frustration, embarrassment, or surprise. Her stillness had an almost hypnotic quality that began to make some observers slightly uncomfortable, though neither Reeves nor Sinclair seemed to notice. She wasn't fidgeting with her handbag, checking her phone, or displaying any of the typical behaviors of someone whose credentials had just been publicly rejected. A third scan attempt produced the same result, accompanied by increasingly confident commentary from both officers. "Ma'am," Reeves said, with what he believed was helpful professionalism, "I can provide you with contact information for the Credential Update Office. They should be able to get you something that actually works with current technology." Sinclair had pulled up what appeared to be a helpful form on her computer screen. "There's also an expedited process if this is urgent, though there might be additional fees involved. I'd recommend calling ahead to make sure they can accommodate whatever department originally issued that ... historical document." The situation had reached what both officers considered a satisfactory conclusion. They had encountered an unusual credential, properly followed security protocols by rejecting it, and professionally explained the next steps to the individual involved. In their minds, this was exactly the kind of competent handling of irregular situations that would reflect well in their performance evaluations. Neither guard noticed that Elena had shifted her weight slightly, a subtle change in posture that suggested someone preparing for the next phase of a process rather than someone accepting defeat. Her eyes hadn't left the scanner during their multiple attempts, and her expression suggested someone waiting for something rather than someone surprised by rejection. The small crowd of observers had begun to disperse, their entertainment concluded, returning to their morning routines with the satisfied feeling of having witnessed a minor comedy at someone else's expense. The maintenance supervisor pocketed his phone and headed toward the elevator banks, while the research assistants resumed their discussion about weekend plans as they walked toward the stairwell. Reeves placed Elena's badge on the counter between them with a gesture that suggested the matter was concluded. "So, ma'am, what would you like to do about getting that updated? I can print out some information about the credential renewal process, if that would be helpful." Sinclair was already turning back to her computer, clearly considering the incident, resolved and ready to move on to other tasks. "Honestly, I'm impressed that badge lasted as long as it did without falling apart. They must have made them pretty durable back in the day." Elena looked at both officers with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire interaction. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the sudden stillness that had settled over the checkpoint area. "Try it one more time," she said simply. "Sometimes these older systems need a moment to connect to the right databases." The comment landed with the kind of weight that made both officers pause and reconsider everything they thought they understood about the situation. Reeves looked at Elena with the kind of patronizing smile that people use when they're certain they understand a situation better than someone else. "Ma'am, I appreciate your patience, but the system has already tried to read your badge 3 times. Modern scanners don't need a moment to connect. They either recognize valid credentials instantly or they don't. Sinclair glanced up from her computer screen with mild irritation. She had already moved on mentally, ready to process the next visitor or return to her administrative tasks. Look, the technology is pretty straightforward. If the badge were valid, the system would have recognized it immediately. These scanners are connected to every federal database in real time. Elena's expression remained unchanged, but something in her stillness had shifted, not impatience, but the quality of someone who had reached a decision point. The databases you access aren't the only ones that exist. Some credentials require additional verification protocols that take longer to authenticate. The comment carried an odd certainty that made both officers pause. There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't guessing or hoping, but stating a fact based on knowledge they didn't possess. Reeves felt the first small flutter of uncertainty, though his confidence in the system's capabilities remained intact. "All right," he said, picking up the badge again with less theatrical flair than before. "One more try, but I'm telling you, the result is going to be exactly the same." He positioned the badge against the scanner for the fourth time, this time without commentary or audience playing. The red light blinked once, as it had before, and for a moment, the screen displayed the same error message that had appeared 3 times already. Sinclair started to say something about persistent optimism, but her words died as the screen suddenly went black. The scanner made a sound neither officer had ever heard before, not the familiar electronic beep of recognition or rejection, but a deep, mechanical clicking that seemed to come from somewhere inside the device itself. The black screen held for several seconds longer than any normal processing cycle, long enough for both guards to lean forward with growing concern. Then the display came alive with something entirely different. Instead of the standard green or red verification screens they were accustomed to, the monitor filled with a deep blue background that neither officer recognized. In the center, a silver emblem began to materialize, not loading like a graphic file, but appearing with the smooth precision of classified government systems that operated by different rules than civilian technology. The emblem was elegant and unmistakable. A stylized eagle with wings spread above a shield containing geometric patterns that seemed to shift slightly as they watched. Around the perimeter, text appeared in bold white letters: Omega Clearance Verified, Deep Access Authorized. Reeves' hand froze an inch from the keyboard. What the hell is Omega Clearance? Before Sinclair could respond, more text began appearing on the screen in rapid succession. Subject: Drive, Elena Vasquez, Special Operations Division. Authorization level: classified above secret. Access granted. All levels nitrogen monoxide restrictions. Notify command immediately. The final line appeared in flashing red text that seemed to pulse with urgency. Priority Alpha Protocol activated. Sinclair's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a ceramic crash that echoed through the suddenly silent atrium. The small crowd that had been dispersing stopped dead in their tracks, drawn back by the unusual commotion. At the security desk. But this time, no one was smiling. The scanner continued its sequence, displaying information that made both officers increasingly pale. A detailed profile filled the screen: Elena's photograph, updated and current, alongside credentials that listed affiliations with agencies they had never heard of: Strategic Intelligence Analysis Division, Cross-Platform Operations Coordination, Special Projects Oversight Committee. More disturbing were the authorization codes that kept appearing. Access levels labeled with designations like Cosmic and Above Top Secret, and classification markers that seemed to exist in an entirely different hierarchy than anything covered. In their training, Reeves stared at the screen like he was watching his career dissolve in real time. This can't be right. We don't have anyone with this level of clearance at Meridian. This has to be some kind of system error. But even as he spoke, alarms began sounding throughout the building, not the sharp, urgent blare of emergency evacuations, but the deeper, more ominous tone of security protocols being activated. Overhead speakers crackled to life with announcements. In codes that neither guard understood, Delta 7 to Command Center. Priority Alpha verification in progress, followed by responses that suggested the entire facility was suddenly operating under different rules. Elena had not moved from her position in front of the desk, but her demeanor had subtly shifted from patient civilian to something else entirely. She wasn't gloating or displaying satisfaction at their obvious shock. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being in classified environments where these protocols were routine rather than extraordinary. Screen continued to update with information that painted an increasingly complete picture of exactly who they had been mocking for the past 15 minutes. Elena's clearance history showed access to facilities at the Pentagon, CIA headquarters in Langley, and locations that weren't identified by name, but only by alphanumeric codes. Her authorization covered operations spanning multiple continents and involving agencies that most federal employees never knew existed. Sinclair found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. Dr. Vasquez, we didn't realize. Your credentials appeared to be outdated, Elena said quietly, finishing the sentence. I know how they look. That's intentional. The most sensitive credentials are often designed to appear unremarkable to people who don't need to know what they represent. More personnel were arriving in the atrium now, not casual observers drawn by curiosity, but individuals in suits who moved with purpose and carried themselves like people accustomed to handling classified situations. A woman in a dark blue blazer approached the security desk with the measured stride of someone taking control of a situation that had escalated beyond normal protocols. The scanner screen was now displaying a final message that made both officers understand the magnitude of their mistake. Dr. Vasquez is authorized for unrestricted access to all levels of this facility. Any delay in processing is to be reported immediately to facility command. Reeves looked from the screen to Elena to the approaching officials with the expression of someone who had just realized he was standing in the middle of something far beyond his understanding. Ma'am, we apologize for any inconvenience. We weren't aware of your ... status. Elena's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had been through variations of this scenario before, in other facilities, with other security personnel who had learned the same lesson these officers were learning now, that the most important people often look exactly like everyone else, until the moment they don't. The officials in suits had reached the security desk, and one of them was already speaking quietly into a radio. Using terminology that confirmed this situation was being escalated to levels that neither Reeves nor Sinclair had security clearance to understand. The morning's routine had just become something else entirely. The building-wide alarm system that had activated wasn't the standard evacuation tone that most Meridian employees recognized from monthly safety drills. This was something deeper, more urgent, with a rhythmic pattern that suggested protocols few people in the facility had ever experienced. Throughout the 12 floors of the research complex, personnel began receiving notifications on their secure terminals, brief messages in coded language that indicated a security event requiring immediate attention from authorized personnel only. On the 7th floor, Dr. Marcus Thompson looked up from his quantum mechanics calculations as his computer screen flashed with an alert he'd never seen before. Security Protocol Delta 7 activated. ALL. Non-essential personnel remain in current positions. He exchanged puzzled glances with his research partner, Dr. Sarah Chun, who was receiving the same notification. Neither had any idea what Delta 7 meant, but both understood that their morning research schedule had just been indefinitely suspended. In the administrative wing on the 4th floor, department heads were being quietly pulled from meetings by assistants. carrying sealed folders marked with classification levels that made seasoned government employees straighten their shoulders and lower their voices. Phone calls were being made to numbers that didn't appear in standard directories, using phrases that had been rehearsed but never expected to be needed. Back in the main atrium, the situation around the security checkpoint was evolving with the precision of a military operation that had been planned in advance but hoped never to be necessary. The woman in the dark blue blazer who had approached the desk introduced herself to Elena with the respectful bearing of someone who clearly understood exactly who she was addressing. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm Deputy Director Catherine Walsh from Facility Security Command. We apologize for any inconvenience during your credential verification process. If you'll come with me, we have a secure briefing room prepared where we can discuss your requirements and ensure you have appropriate access for your visit." Elena nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and approval of how the situation was now being handled. "Thank you, Director Walsh. I'll need access to the classified research archives and secure communication systems for approximately 6 hours." Walsh's expression didn't change, but her response indicated she was operating from briefing materials that had provided her with substantial background information. "All arrangements have been made, Doctor. We have a dedicated liaison team standing by to assist with any technical requirements or coordination needs." Meanwhile, Reeves and Sinclair remained frozen at their posts, watching this exchange with the growing understanding that they were witnessing the aftermath of what might be the most significant mistake of their professional careers. Neither had moved to process any other visitors, partly because they were too shocked to resume normal operations, and partly because it was becoming clear that normal operations had been suspended throughout the facility. Additional security personnel were arriving in the atrium, not the standard guards that Reeves and Sinclair worked alongside, but individuals in suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. They positioned themselves with practiced efficiency around the main entrances and elevator banks, creating a security perimeter that was subtle but unmistakably professional. A tall man with silver hair and the posture of retired military approached the security desk where Reeves and Sinclair sat in stunned silence. His identification badge showed him to be Assistant Director James Morrison, Facility Security Operations, a name that neither guard recognized, which suggested he operated at levels of the organization they had never encountered. "Officers Reeves and Sinclair," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made both guards instinctively stand straighter. "I need a complete verbal report of your interaction with Dr. Vasquez, beginning from the moment she approached your station. Include every detail, every comment, and every action taken by either of you during the credential verification process." Reeves felt his mouth go dry. "Sir, we followed standard protocol for credential verification. The badge appeared to be outdated, and our initial scans returned format errors, so we ... Morrison held up one hand, cutting him off. "I need specifics, Officer Reeves. Exactly what was said, by whom, and in what order. This conversation is being recorded for security purposes and will be reviewed by personnel whose clearance levels you don't need to know about." The silence that followed was filled with the quiet hum of secure communication equipment and the distant sound of increased security activity throughout the building. Each person in the room understood that their careers, their research programs, and quite possibly the future of Meridian itself now, depended on how effectively they could demonstrate that the morning's incident was an isolated failure rather than evidence of systemic security problems. Back on the main floor, Assistant Director Morrison was conducting what he diplomatically termed enhanced interviews with facility personnel who had witnessed the incident at the security checkpoint. The maintenance supervisor who had paused to listen to the guards' mockery was discovering that his casual amusement had been noted by federal security personnel who took a very different view of the situation. "Mr. Peterson, Morrison said, reviewing notes on his tablet. You observed the entire interaction between Dr. Vasquez and the security officers. At any point did you consider intervening or reporting what appeared to be inappropriate treatment of a facility visitor? Peterson, who had 30 years of experience maintaining government buildings and thought he'd seen every kind of bureaucratic comedy, was learning that some situations weren't actually funny when viewed from a security perspective. Sir, I assumed the guards knew what they were doing. It never occurred to me that someone carrying legitimate credentials would be treated that way. The response highlighted exactly the kind of assumption that made security professionals lose sleep. If experienced, facility personnel could witness obvious protocol violations without recognizing them as problems. It suggested cultural issues that extended far beyond the actions of two individual guards. Morrison's radio provided periodic updates on the expanding investigation. Interview with research staff on 4th floor complete, followed by IT security. Conducting access log review and external agency coordination in progress. Each update represented another layer of scrutiny that would examine not just the morning's incident, but the systems, training, and oversight that had allowed it to occur. In the facility's main IT center, technicians were discovering that Elena's badge scan had triggered automatic notifications to agencies they hadn't known were monitoring Meridian's security systems. The Omega clearance verification had generated electronic reports that were already being reviewed by oversight committees whose existence was news to most facility IT staff, the technology infrastructure that most employees thought of as routine. Administrative Systems was revealing connections to federal security networks that operated at classification levels well above anything covered in standard facility orientation materials. Elena's credentials hadn't just identified her as an important person. They had activated reporting protocols that connected Meridian to oversight mechanisms most facility personnel had never imagined. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the morning's incident had exposed security vulnerabilities that extended far beyond two guards who had made poor decisions. The real problem was a facility-wide culture that had become too comfortable with routine, too confident in assumptions, and too disconnected from the reality that some visitors carried credentials that existed in the most classified corners of the federal security apparatus. The consequences were going to be measured not in days or weeks, but in months of reviews, audits, and policy changes that would remind everyone at Meridian that respect and protocol weren't just nice ideas. They were essential elements of national security that some people had apparently forgotten. General Rodriguez opened a classified briefing folder that had been delivered to Meridian by secure courier during the emergency meeting. The documents inside bore classification markings that exceeded the clearance levels of most people in the room. But the gravity of the situation required disclosure of information that would normally remain compartmentalized at the highest levels of government. Before we discuss consequences and corrective measures, the general said, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal information that would fundamentally change how everyone present understood the morning's events. You need to understand exactly who Dr. Elena Vasquez is and why her treatment at this facility has triggered involvement from agencies that most of you have never heard of. She removed a photograph from the folder, a formal portrait that showed Elena in military dress uniform. Younger, but unmistakably the same woman who had stood patiently at the security checkpoint while being mocked. The uniform bore insignia that Colonel Vance recognized but had never seen worn by anyone she'd actually met. Dr. Vasquez spent 12 years as the primary scientific advisor for Operation Blackwater, a classified program that developed counterintelligence technologies for the most sensitive operations conducted by this country. Her work directly contributed to preventing at least 6 major security breaches that could have compromised assets operating in hostile territory across 3 continents. Dr. Harrison felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. General, when you say prevented security breaches, I mean, Rodriguez continued, that Dr. Vasquez's research and analysis saved the lives of intelligence operatives whose identities remain classified at levels that exceed your security clearance. Her work prevented the compromise of surveillance systems protecting. The silence that followed was filled with the quiet hum of secure communication equipment and the distant sound of increased security activity throughout the building. Each person in the room understood that their careers, their research programs, and quite possibly the future of Meridian itself now, depended on how effectively they could demonstrate that the morning's incident was an isolated failure rather than evidence of systemic security problems. Back on the main floor, Assistant Director Morrison was conducting what he diplomatically termed enhanced interviews with facility personnel who had witnessed the incident at the security checkpoint. The maintenance supervisor who had paused to listen to the guards' mockery was discovering that his casual amusement had been noted by federal security personnel who took a very different view of the situation. "Mr. Peterson," Morrison said, reviewing notes on his tablet, "you observed the entire interaction between Dr. Vasquez and the security officers. At any point did you consider intervening or reporting what appeared to be inappropriate treatment of a facility visitor?" Peterson, who had 30 years of experience maintaining government buildings and thought he'd seen every kind of bureaucratic comedy, was learning that some situations weren't actually funny when viewed from a security perspective. "Sir, I assumed the guards knew what they were doing. It never occurred to me that someone carrying legitimate credentials would be treated that way." The response highlighted exactly the kind of assumption that made security professionals lose sleep. If experienced facility personnel could witness obvious protocol violations without recognizing them as problems, it suggested cultural issues that extended far beyond the actions of two individual guards. Morrison's radio provided periodic updates on the expanding investigation. Interview with research staff on 4th floor complete, followed by IT security. Conducting access log review and external agency coordination in progress. Each update represented another layer of scrutiny that would examine not just the morning's incident, but the systems, training, and oversight that had allowed it to occur. In the facility's main IT center, technicians were discovering that Elena's badge scan had triggered automatic notifications to agencies they hadn't known were monitoring Meridian's security systems. The Omega clearance verification had generated electronic reports that were already being reviewed by oversight committees whose existence was news to most facility IT staff, the technology infrastructure that most employees thought of as routine. Administrative Systems was revealing connections to federal security networks that operated at classification levels well above anything covered in standard facility orientation materials. Elena's credentials hadn't just identified her as an important person. They had activated reporting protocols that connected Meridian to oversight mechanisms most facility personnel had never imagined. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the morning's incident had exposed security vulnerabilities that extended far beyond two guards who had made poor decisions. The real problem was a facility-wide culture that had become too comfortable with routine, too confident in assumptions, and too disconnected from the reality that some visitors carried credentials that existed in the most classified corners of the federal security apparatus. The consequences were going to be measured not in days or weeks, but in months of reviews, audits, and policy changes that would remind everyone at Meridian that respect and protocol weren't just nice ideas. They were essential elements of national security that some people had apparently forgotten. General Rodriguez opened a classified briefing folder that had been delivered to Meridian by secure courier during the emergency meeting. The documents inside bore classification markings that exceeded the clearance levels of most people in the room. But the gravity of the situation required disclosure of information that would normally remain compartmentalized at the highest levels of government. Before we discuss consequences and corrective measures, Rodriguez continued reading. Facility personnel demonstrated willingness to publicly mock credentials they didn't recognize, suggesting inadequate training in classification systems and inappropriate attitudes toward security protocols. Multiple staff members observed inappropriate behavior without intervention, indicating cultural problems that extend beyond individual personnel failures. Dr. Chun interrupted with a question that carried obvious desperation. "General, is there any way to mitigate these findings? Can we demonstrate that this was an isolated incident rather than representative behavior?" Rodriguez's response was measured but offered little comfort. Dr. Vasquez's assessment will be reviewed by oversight committees that determine facility security ratings, funding authorizations, and operational permissions for classified research programs. The review process typically takes 6 to 8 months and involves detailed examination of all facility operations, personnel files, and security procedures. She closed the folder with the finality of someone who had delivered information that couldn't be taken back or minimized through explanation. What happened here this morning wasn't just embarrassing. It was a documented security failure observed by someone whose professional responsibility is to identify exactly these kinds of problems. The conference room fell silent except for the distant sounds of ongoing security activity throughout the building. Each person present understood that their facility had been evaluated by an expert, specifically trained to identify security vulnerabilities, and they had failed that evaluation in the most public and embarrassing way possible. Elena Vasquez hadn't been an unlucky visitor who happened to carry unusual credentials. She had been a federal security expert conducting an unannounced assessment, and Meridian had demonstrated exactly the kind of security culture problems that such assessments were designed to identify. The morning's comedy had become a documented security failure that would affect everything from personnel careers to facility funding, all observed and recorded by someone whose job was to determine whether places like Meridian could be trusted with the nation's most sensitive secrets. By late afternoon, the administrative machinery of consequence was operating with the precision of a system designed to handle exactly these kinds of security failures. General Rodriguez had remained at Meridian to personally oversee the implementation of immediate corrective measures, her presence ensuring that recommendations would be executed rather than filed away for future consideration. In the facility's main conference room, now functioning as a temporary command center for what was being termed security protocol remediation, officials were working through a comprehensive action plan that would affect every aspect of Meridian's operations. The decisions being made would ripple through personnel files, training programs, and operational procedures with the systematic thoroughness that characterized federal responses to documented security vulnerabilities. Officers Daniel Reeves and Janet Sinclair had been summoned to Assistant Director Morrison's office for what the paperwork described as administrative disposition proceedings. Both had spent the intervening hours understanding that their morning's entertainment would be evaluated by standards they hadn't fully appreciated when they chose to treat Elena's credentials as a source of amusement. Morrison's office reflected the serious nature of federal security oversight, walls lined with framed certifications, security protocols, and photographs that documented his career managing classified facilities across multiple agencies. His desk contained their personnel files, incident reports, and recommendation documents that would determine whether they continued working in federal security or found new career paths entirely. "Officers Reeves and Sinclair," Morrison began, his tone carrying the formal weight of someone delivering conclusions that had been carefully considered and wouldn't be revised through appeal or explanation. "Your actions this morning constitute violations of multiple security protocols, federal regulations governing the treatment of classified personnel, and basic professional standards expected of federal security employees." He opened Reeves' personnel file first, reviewing 8 months of what had previously been considered satisfactory performance evaluations. Officer Reeves, your decision to publicly mock credentials you didn't recognize violated Protocol 7A. Regarding unknown identification verification, Federal Regulation 152.3, concerning respectful treatment of all facility visitors, and basic security awareness requirements covered in your initial training. Reeves felt his career dissolving as Morrison enumerated each specific violation with the precision of someone who had dealt with security failures before and understood exactly how such failures were processed through federal administrative systems. Sir, I want to acknowledge that our behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional. We mishandled the situation completely. Morrison's expression suggested that acknowledgement, while appropriate, wouldn't affect conclusions that had already been reached by people whose authority in these matters exceeded his own. Officer Reeves, your acknowledgement is noted and will be included in your file. However, the consequences for security protocol violations are determined by regulation rather than personal remorse. He turned to Sinclair's file, which painted a similar picture of routine competence that had been catastrophically undermined by a single morning's poor judgment. Officer Sinclair, your participation in the mockery of Dr. Vasquez's credentials demonstrated the same violations as Officer Reeves, with the additional concern that you escalated the inappropriate behavior rather than moderating it. Sinclair had spent the day understanding that her jokes about museum exhibits and obsolete technology had been observed by someone whose professional responsibility was to document exactly those kinds of security culture problems. Sir, I understand that. We made serious mistakes. Is there any possibility of remedial training or additional education that might allow us to continue in federal security? Morrison consulted documents that bore classification markings indicating review by authorities beyond facility level. The incident this morning has been evaluated by the Federal Security Personnel Review Board, whose recommendations regarding personnel actions and classified security failures carry binding authority for all federal facilities. He removed 2 documents from a sealed folder, each bearing the official seals that indicated decisions had been made at levels that wouldn't be reversed through local administrative appeals. Officer Reeves, you are hereby relieved of duties involving classified facility security, effective immediately. Your security clearance is suspended pending comprehensive review, and you are reassigned to general administrative duties at a non-classified government facility to be determined by Federal Personnel Placement Services. The words carried the finality of bureaucratic judgment that had been rendered, according to regulations that didn't allow for explanations about misunderstanding or inexperience. Reeves' career in federal security had ended the moment he decided to treat Elena's credentials as entertainment rather than following established verification protocols. Morrison turned to Sinclair with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized federal responses to security failures. Officer Sinclair, your reassignment follows the same pattern as Officer Reeves, with the additional requirement that you complete mandatory training in professional conduct and security awareness before placement in any federal position. Both officers understood that their morning's amusement had become a documented example of exactly the kind of security culture problems that oversight agencies were designed to identify and correct. Their names would appear in training materials, case studies, and policy documents as illustrations of what happened when security personnel failed to maintain appropriate standards. Meanwhile, throughout Meridian, other consequences were being implemented with the efficiency of a system designed to respond quickly to identified vulnerabilities. The 14 facility personnel who had witnessed the incident were being required to complete additional security awareness training, their observation of inappropriate behavior without intervention having been noted as evidence of cultural problems that extended beyond individual personnel failures. Dr. Harrison was meeting with budget officials who were explaining how security assessment failures affected facility funding, operational authorizations, and the classification levels of research that could be conducted during the review period. His afternoon was being spent understanding that administrative convenience and cost considerations were secondary to security compliance. When evaluated by agencies whose patience with failures was measured in career consequences rather than second chances, Colonel Vance was coordinating with military liaison offices to ensure that facility security protocols were updated to reflect standards that would satisfy oversight agencies whose review processes were designed to prevent rather than correct security vulnerabilities. Her experience with military security was proving valuable in implementing changes that would demonstrate serious commitment to addressing identified problems. As evening approached, Elena Vasquez completed her work in Meridian's classified research areas, her investigation having expanded from routine security assessment to comprehensive documentation of systemic problems that would require months of correction and oversight. Her final report would serve as the foundation for facility-wide changes that would affect everything from personnel hiring standards to daily operational procedures. She departed Meridian through the same main entrance where her morning had begun, but the facility she left behind was fundamentally different from the one she had entered. The casual attitudes toward security protocols, the willingness to mock credentials that weren't immediately understood, and the cultural acceptance of inappropriate behavior had been identified, documented, and marked for correction through systematic administrative action. The consequences would continue long after Elena's departure, rippling through careers, policies, and procedures with the methodical thoroughness that characterized federal responses to security failures that had been observed by people whose job was to identify exactly those problems. 3 months after Dr. Elena Vasquez's visit to Meridian, the facility operated under what staff had come to call the new normal, a comprehensive security culture that reflected hard-learned lessons about respect, protocol, and the dangerous assumptions that could destroy careers in a single morning. The changes weren't merely administrative adjustments. They represented a fundamental shift in how everyone at the facility understood their responsibilities and the potential consequences of treating security protocols as suggestions rather than requirements. The main security checkpoint bore little resemblance to the casual, entertainment-seeking environment that had existed during Daniel Reeves and Janet Sinclair's tenure. The new security officers, both veterans with extensive experience in classified environments, approached credential verification with the systematic thoroughness that reflected understanding of exactly what could go wrong when protocols were ignored in favor of personal amusement. Elena's comprehensive assessment report had become required reading for all Meridian personnel, though most staff members were only cleared to read the unclassified sections that focused on security culture rather than specific operational vulnerabilities. The document served as a stark reminder that their facility operated under constant scrutiny from oversight agencies whose evaluations could affect everything from individual careers to institutional funding. The lessons from that October morning had rippled far beyond Meridian itself. Elena's incident report had been distributed throughout the federal security community as a case study in how quickly routine interactions could become documented failures when personnel lost sight of basic professional standards. Training programs at classified facilities across the country now included specific modules about respectful treatment of all visitors, proper protocols for unusual credentials, and the importance of understanding that assumptions could be catastrophically wrong. Daniel Reeves had found new employment as a security coordinator at a regional airport, where his federal experience was valued but his mistakes at Meridian served as daily reminders about the importance of following established procedures. Without exception, his morning routine now included reviewing protocols that emphasized respectful treatment of all travelers, regardless of how their documentation might appear to inexperienced personnel. The irony wasn't lost on him that his current position required Exactly the kind of careful, respectful credential verification that he had failed to provide at Meridian. Every unusual passport, every unfamiliar identification document, every situation that didn't match standard expectations became an opportunity to demonstrate the professional growth that his previous failure had necessitated. Janet Sinclair had completed her mandatory retraining program and accepted a position with the General Services Administration, managing administrative support for government facilities that handled unclassified operations. Her work kept her connected to federal service while ensuring that her future responsibilities wouldn't involve the kind of classified security decisions where her previous poor judgment could have national security implications. Both former officers had learned the same lesson that now shaped security training programs throughout the federal system. Respect isn't something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it. Respect is something you provide until someone demonstrates they don't merit it. The distinction was subtle but crucial, reflecting the difference between security cultures that protected national interests and those that created vulnerabilities through assumption and arrogance. At Meridian, the new security protocols required verification of all credentials through appropriate channels before making any determinations about validity or obsolescence. The entertainment that Reeves and Sinclair had found in Elena's vintage appearing badge had been replaced by systematic processes that recognized the complexity of federal classification systems and the possibility that unusual credentials might indicate higher rather than lower levels of authorization. Dr. Harrison had survived the security review process, though his leadership of the facility now operated under enhanced oversight that included quarterly assessments by agencies whose existence most facility personnel still didn't fully understand. His management style had evolved to emphasize security culture as a foundation for all other operations, understanding that research excellence meant nothing if security failures prevented the facility from maintaining its classified research authorizations. The broader lessons from Elena's assessment had influenced policy development at levels that extended far beyond individual facilities. The Special Access Program Review Board had used Meridian as a model for identifying cultural vulnerabilities that could compromise security regardless of technological safeguards or administrative procedures. Technology could verify credentials, but only human judgment could determine whether security protocols were being followed with the seriousness that classified operations required. Elena herself had moved on to other assessments, other facilities, other opportunities to observe how security culture either protected or endangered national interests. Her work remained largely invisible to public awareness, but her influence shaped the daily operations of classified facilities across multiple agencies. The respect she had been denied at Meridian was now built into training programs that ensured other security personnel understood the potential consequences of treating unusual credentials as sources of amusement rather than reasons for careful verification. The morning that had begun with mockery and ended with career consequences had become a teaching moment that influenced how thousands of federal security personnel approached their responsibilities. The story was told in training sessions, discussed in security conferences, and referenced in policy documents as an illustration of how quickly professional situations could deteriorate when personnel forgot that their primary responsibility was protection rather than entertainment. Years later, when new security officers were trained at facilities handling classified operations, they learned about the morning when two guards thought they were clever enough to mock credentials they didn't understand, only to discover they had been entertaining themselves at the expense of someone whose job was to identify exactly the kind of security culture problems they had demonstrated. The lesson resonated beyond government facilities, becoming a reminder that respect and professionalism weren't bureaucratic formalities but essential elements of any organization that claimed to take its responsibilities seriously. Whether in corporate boardrooms, academic institutions, or community organizations, The principle remained constant. You never know who you're talking to, what experiences they carry, or what authority they might possess. Elena's story became a testament to the power of quiet dignity in the face of disrespect, the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of how others behave, and the reality that true authority often looks exactly like everyone else until the moment it doesn't. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of how they looked or what they carried? What would you have done if you'd been working at that security checkpoint when Dr. Vasquez presented her credentials? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us about a time when your assumptions about someone were completely wrong. If this story reminded you that respect should be our default setting rather than something we withhold until people prove themselves worthy, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about dignity, professionalism, and the consequences of judging others by appearances. Remember, the most powerful people often look exactly like everyone else, and the most important credentials might not match your expectations. Treat everyone with respect, follow established protocols, and understand that your assumptions could be catastrophically wrong. Watch our next video about hidden heroes and quiet courage, and we'll see you tomorrow right here on Professional Dignity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.